Well, hey, hello. It is Friday. Isn't Friday nice? Friday. I should put my little, there you go. My name is Mark Tomlinson. I am the Chief Performacologist here in the PerfBytes world, bringing you the weekly Friday PerfBits. I hope everyone is doing very, very well. And again, thoughts and prayers and holy crap to everyone in the Ukraine and everyone in the area. Can we just please knock that crap off? You know, that would be nice to not be at war. I'm a little concerned. And so if everyone's feeling stressed or everyone doesn't know what to do, donate, contribute. I even know people in our community, in the tech community, that are like, hey, can I take a sabbatical from my job and go fight on the streets in Ukraine or in the countryside? So thoughts and prayers. At the same time, do something. Take some action. It's horrendous. At least in my lifetime. This week, before we start talking about stuff, I want to talk about forgiveness, and not forgiveness in a mushy, emotional kind of way, but more specifically in a load generation way. And I'll get into the details of that in terms of how you should be really punishing the system under test as much as you can possibly can. But before I do that, I always want to give a shout out to the supporters of the PerfBytes community, the PerfBytes show, and that would be Catchpoint APM and the fantastic web page test. They're continually making updates and doing some amazing things. And there's much more. I talk about web page test because it's got the coolest, kind of newest stuff, but there's a whole lot more to the Catchpoint world. No matter what APM tool you're using, and I've used all of them, they have some really, really compelling features as well. So check that, and thanks to the Catchpoint folks for their support. Mostly you have News of the Damned. Hopefully, send a tweet right now to James PerfPully on Twitter and the News of the Damned. Say, come on, give us some YouTube content here, brother. That would be great. Tricentis, our friends at Tricentis, again, Tricentis Neoload and Tricentis Flood are the two main performance products that have supported PerfBytes for nearly 9.5 years. In some cases, fantastic tool sets for cloud-based load testing, on-premise load testing, and doing what we do, whether you're JMeter-based or Java-based within the Neoload world, running however you want to make them run. So check out the Tricentis suite of performance tools. So a shout out to them. You could check it out. All the links, of course, are in the below. Additionally, Ryan Folk. I don't know if you know this guy. He's named Ryan Folk, and he has a bunch of really cool guys. If you go back and listen to old episodes of News of the Damned, Brian joined James several times to review things. And Ryan's been with us at the Dynatrace Perform shows on the air. So thank you very much to Ryan for his support. If you need help from gurus, kind of at our level, if you get back to Lloyd's Publishing, I think from Neocortex, Lloyd's Publishing in the LinkedIn world, you'll see that there's this like kind of peak, and then there's like really people who tried to get out of doing performance work but just couldn't help it and got sucked right back in. And so now we're getting to 20 years experience, 30 years experience, and I have no idea why I still do performance work, mostly because it's fun to blow things up. But it's a serious addiction to causing mayhem in the technology systems of the modern world. So that is a lot of the folks that work with Ryan. So check out Ryan Folk Consulting, again, link below. And you'll see some new content. I talk about it, and Fede, Roger, and Sophie. There's Sophie Abstracta. Abstracta is a new supporter of PerfBytes. We're going to do some deep dive episodes, particularly around JMeter. They have a product called Aptim, check it out for mobile performance. Some actually really cool stuff. So check it out, and we'll look for some new stuff. So shout out to the folks at Abstracta. Would be really, really swell. So let's talk about forgiveness. And two main things off the top of my head this week, because this is a conversation I had with my own team, talking about how a load generation tool is what kind of pressure. And so there's one concept to think about is arrival rate. And arrival rate is a new initiation of a connection from a client to a server. And from the server's perspective, you have connections or requests arriving. The connection physically might be open to the client, but a new request for a transaction, for a piece of code, whatever it is, how often and what's the frequency of the arrival rate? We receive, or there are 200 transactions per second. We used to call them hits per second in the early web days, but hits per second, or the arrival rate. And so think about arrival rate. Like when you're generating load, what kind of throughput? I teach a lot of folks to think about volume, throughput. What's the volume of concurrent load? And when we talk about arrival rate, it's usually not a single connection with a single thread making repeated calls. It is a multiple connection thing. So multiple connections concurrently in parallel at 30 transactions per second, or 300 or 3,000 transactions per second, you would have them arriving at the load balancer, the server system, whatever it is, which is really swell. And there's some chatting here from bots. I can see the bots are still alive. Thanks for joining the call. That's really nice. I'll have to block you. But we must be popular if the bots are on there. All right, arrival rate. So one idea is arrival rate. The other idea to keep in mind is iteration pacing. And in LoadRunner, in the early tools, a lot of our habit, or I'll say an anti-pattern for load generation is to run with no think time, no iteration pacing. You're just going to take that load generator and it's going to go and generate, I want to see how much load the system can handle. And you're not really proactively thinking through iteration pacing. And so let me flip over. I'm going to hope this works. The iteration pacing idea works like this. Let's say our general, I'm going to go over here, 200 and, all right, there you go, 250 milliseconds, something like that. 200, it looks like 258, but it's 250 milliseconds. So iteration pacing wise, that means I could, if the response time for a single thread, a single serialized, a single virtual user, a single thread. If you're using a tool that has non-blocking I/O, something like Locust, I think, does that. You could think of it in, I think the K6 stuff does that. Any of the tools that use more non-blocking I/O, it could be the same socket, the same series of sockets or connections, but it takes 250 milliseconds for the application under test system under test to respond. So you could do a maximum of 4. So here's 250. I can't draw today. So 250, 250. How is that different, Mark? So you could do 4 transactions in 1 second. So one thread, like in JMeter, one thread can create 4 transactions per second. If the system under test reaches 250 milliseconds, and I mean actual 250 milliseconds. What happens if you've got a perfect system that perfectly responds at 250 milliseconds, as you increase the load, there's no room for that load, for the system to maintain 4 transactions per second. And let's say we multiply that by 1,000 threads in JMeter. Now you've got 4,000 TPS. Okay, keep that in mind. I'm going to move this up to try to do this a little differently. If then I have a system that's ramping up and increasing the number of users, so this is the number of threads, and it's increasing from 0 up to 1,000. And the response time under load, as the load increases, let's say the response time was 250, maybe that's elapsed time, elapsed time. Over time, the elapsed time, as you're increasing the number of users, the response time, if it's really fast, you'll maintain 1,000 threads, number of threads, up to n number of transactions per second. So you expect, as you increase the load, response times should stay nice and, let's say, sorry, this is my number of threads. And this is response time. Up there, and this is elapsed time. This is Fridays for me. It's dumping stuff out of my brain. So as the number of threads increase, you'll see response time stays, let's say, 250 milliseconds, right about here, right? At some point, let's say you hit about 3,000 threads, right about that point. Response times, as long as they reach up to 250 milliseconds, you're going to maintain your target. I want to reach 4,000 TPS. So your actual number, if I hit 4,000 threads at the top, that's 4,000 TPS. But the minute my response time goes over 250 milliseconds, right? So let's say I get to 500 milliseconds, half a second. So if the response time goes over 250 milliseconds by an amount, what you'll see is the actual throughput drops off, which, as you're increasing load over time, as things are humming along, you increase the load up to 1,000 threads, and throughput is increasing linearly as it's going along, and we get to about 3,000 threads, and suddenly throughput starts to drop off because response time down here started to get slower and crossed that 250 millisecond threshold. Does that make sense? So, which means if the thread doesn't have any waiting time, iteration-wise, the minute it gets over the pacing, if you pace those threads out, hey, I want you to do 4 iterations per second, and you could do that per minute. You could figure out exactly how many you want, 240. So you've got 4 per second times 60. And so you could figure out what you want for iteration pacing, but you have no breathing room. There's no room in that timing for the system to slow down. Maybe it goes up to 50 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds, it gets to 250. And if it starts to go over 250, those threads are the JMeter thread or the load generation thread becomes very forgiving. It's like, oh, I see you, server. I see you slowing down a little bit. Maybe I'll be nice to you. And since my thread has to wait, I won't submit, my arrival rate falls off. I won't submit another request because I'm waiting for you because I understand you're slow and you're having a hard day. So what you want to do is run more threads slower. And so if we go back to the iteration pacing model, if I know typically I get 200 here, like within 1 second, I've got 250 milliseconds in that first second. And I want to allow the system, like this is kind of the average. As I ramp up, if I know kind of my average 250, sure, there's some spikes above there, below there, but let's say it's a very narrow standard deviation. Let's say, typically cut that in half. Here's 125 milliseconds. As we're ramping up the load, we're seeing around, I think if we could run steady state at, say, 500 threads, generating 2,000 transactions per second, maybe we have about 125 milliseconds. That means we can do an iteration and then the thread will just sleep. Or it'll sit there, it'll wait. Hey, I'm gonna sleep for 125 milliseconds and then I'm gonna fire off another one. And then that one takes, let's say, 100 milliseconds, and then it's gonna sleep for another 150 milliseconds. Sleeping. Same kind of thing. You get the idea. Let's say you have a transaction that goes really fast, and then it's going to wait for 200 milliseconds. And then you have a transaction that goes really slow that takes 200 milliseconds, and then it waits 50 milliseconds. So this is activity and sleep. Activity and sleep. Activity and sleep and activity and sleep. My advice is to change this up a little bit so you give lots and lots of room for the system under test to slow down. So instead of doing back-to-back, make this sleep interval 4 or 5 times. So if my sleep at, my average here, when I'm running at 2,000 transactions per second, is about 125 milliseconds. What I would say, let's say round that up, 200 milliseconds. I don't want to do another call for wait a huge amount of time. And so that means you have to run more threads, but you run them slower in the pacing. So instead of a pacing of 250 milliseconds, let me go back to the next page here. I'm trying to get this idea out there. It's in my head correctly, but got to get it out. So if I have 4 TPS, 4 transactions for a single thread, and that's 1 every 250 milliseconds for a thread, I could say I want 4 TPS, but and that's running to get to my 4 TPS, to get to 4,000. There's my 4,000, 4 TPS. With 1 every 250 milliseconds, I need 1,000 threads. So 4,000 TPS, that's 4 TPS, 1 every 250 milliseconds for 1,000 threads or vusers, just as an idea. Instead of going at 4 TPS, if I do 1 TPS, sorry, I'm going to make this a big looking one. I still want to get to my 4,000 TPS, but this is 1 TPS, so that's 1 every 1,000 milliseconds. How many threads will I need? Well, 1,000 times 4 equals 4,000. So what times 1? So I'll need 4,000 threads. Okay? And hopefully in your test tool, your threads are cheap or free. Because I think we got away from that a long time ago. What that looks like then is, let's say, again, we have the iteration clock in 1 second. 1 second. Let's say my average response time is 250 milliseconds, right? So I get somewhere in there 125, 250. I've got 750 milliseconds to slow down. That means the system under test can get twice as slow. Right there. 2x, twice as slow. 3 times as slow. Maybe 4 times as slow. Almost. If I push it more than 1 second, I'm going to start being more forgiving. So I like very unforgiving load generators. And if I go back to that other graph here, I threw the wrong thing on the floor. Awesome. Again, if now I'm going to ramp up 4,000 threads over time, and I see TPS going up over time as those threads are increasing, the transactions, because I can get, if it's slow, as it slows down, let's say again we get to 3,000 threads, and it starts to slow down. Here, let's say this is 100 milliseconds, this is 200 milliseconds, and the response time is like 300 milliseconds, 400 millisecond response time, and that means it'll keep up because I have threads that are just waiting there. They're not being delayed. The individual requests are not being delayed by the response time because the pacing is set to have lots more threads running slower. So even though the system under test might be going 300 or 400 milliseconds, we've got at 400 milliseconds, we have another 350 milliseconds of buffer, of spare sleep time, it's think time if you want to think about it, or pacing time, to wait for the system under test before we send in a new request. And you can multiply that. If you're using some tools where threads and virtual users are free, like you could take this to 10x this amount and give yourself an entire minute. So I have scenarios where a thread will only submit 3 transactions a minute, and I run thousands and thousands of threads because there's tons of time for session work and some other timing things to happen. There may be stuff that has to be held on the app server for a very long time, consuming memory. The session stays in there. But if it does 3 transactions a minute, I'm actually exercising those buffers and that caching a little bit more like the real world. To sort of document what I threw on the floor here, an A forgiving load generation scheme says, as the system under test slows down, so will my load generation, because I don't have any time buffer between the amount of the arrival rate. So with that arrival, to maintain that arrival rate, I don't have any time for the threads to say, hey, I have plenty of time sitting around sleeping. A lot of us are sitting sleeping, so we can kind of send a next request right on time, right on schedule. That's an unforgiving, right? It's just, I got plenty of time. If you don't have any buffer, you don't have any time buffer in there, you're going to be very forgiving. So yeah, as the system under test slows down, so will the load. And in a way, you're giving kind of a false result. It may even be, you might say it's a false negative, maybe, but you do find, it might be a false positive. No, it might be. The system under test will appear as if it can only handle so much load, when actually it's worse off. So in a way, it's a false negative, because the condition, you really should have been running much, much more load than you were. But your load generation slowed down because the system under test slowed down. So think about unforgiving load generation as being more accurate to the real world. In the real world, you never know. We're not in control of all the clients. We may be running the server side of things, but we're not in control of who's going to open a browser and hit that URL and submit a payment, submit a whatever they're going to buy a ticket to the thing. They just show, you have no control over them. They're just going to come in. The ones that are already in and being slowed down, sure, they're going to be slower, but those new arrival rates, those new connections, new sessions, you don't control them. So thinking about unforgiving traffic versus forgiving traffic, if you're, in another way, in forgiving. Shout out to Leandro. Hey, Leandro. He joins the chat, which is, I miss seeing him. He's got some great stuff this week. He's on an episode of Pure Performance, our friends in the podcast world. So as usual on a Friday, I'm a little bit, I've had a headache for like days. So anyway, this is a little bit of the idea for iteration pace. Somewhere out there, I have an HP video about iteration pacing that kind of describes this, giving the virtual user more time to breathe, to rest, to sleep before it hits the next thing. It gives permission to the system under test to slow down. So happy Friday. You made it to the end of the week. And thank you for joining me. We have some other announcements coming later this year. Events-wise, there's things happening at STAR Conference. So I think it's STAR East. We're going to do a panel discussion, Leandro and I. And I'm teaching a workshop there. So if you are new to performance and you want an introduction to like load performance stress testing, and you kind of want to get the concepts and get some, while also getting hands-on practice, I'm going to teach that at STAR East. InflectorCon / our friends at SDPCon is in DC the week after that, I think, May 5th or 6th, which is great. Hey, Scott, how's it going? The other, well, there's so many other things going on. TISQA is going on, TSQA, the Triangle Software Quality Assurance, is happening. Equally check that out. It's a research triangle, but it's all online. I think it's partially in person online. We'll see. But I'm actually going to be a moderator. I'm not doing it. I think Leandro might be giving a talk there, which is pretty cool. And there's a bunch of other events online. Also, if you haven't seen, with everyone that's online right now in the chat, there are tons. There is I'll say a performance nerd spring. Remember we had like they called the Arab Spring, and it was like the Twitter and all this. It was like 10 years ago. I think we're having a performance engineering spring, it is springtime. And maybe this headache thing is like allergies. I should look at the allergy meds. But between Scott Moore, our friend Stephen Townsend has been converting stuff SRE-wise. He's prolific in that world. Is it observable from Henrik? You've got a bunch of cool K6 coming out. Scott's also got the SMC Journal. Hey, I'm out of battery juice on that light over there. So which means that one's probably going to go out soon. But I'm at 25 minutes, so I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you guys for joining me. Check out the descriptions below. Like, subscribe, do all the fun things that you can. If you're watching this wherever you're watching this, that would be really great. Go check out the other folks that we've linked below as well from our sponsors. They got some really cool announcements and cool things happening in the PerfBytes world. So thanks for joining me. You guys have a fantastic weekend, and I'll catch you next week for a little bit of PerfBytes.